Welcome to the Vera Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Vera Media Podcast. Today, we got a doozy. We're joined by Shawn Binda and the infamous now Vishal Ganesan. As of this week, how's everyone doing? How are you guys doing?
Doing good, man.
Yeah. How's the past couple days been for you?
I mean, it's been great. I feel like controversy can be very productive and healthy. And so I've obviously been playing it up and leaning into it. But I think it's been to, at least in my view, it's been to productive and healthy ends, which I think and what that end is I think forcing people to try to have a little bit more clarity about what their views are on this. Because I think that all too often there's a sort of faux unity or faux united front that people want to put on because I think it provides some sort of psychological, what do you call it? Cushion. It's helpful for people to be oh yeah, we're a Hindu community and we're united. And it's these appeals have just never sat right with me because I don't really know what the appeal is, what the basis of those appeals have been. So I think, there's obviously a lot more to go into here, but it's been for me, it's been great because I just feel like it's forcing people to really think about where they stand on this. And, the number of comments I've gotten from second generation Hindu Americans, it's been really heartening because that's really my audience, it's a number of people who've reached out to me and been thank you for saying the stuff that we all think, but don't know how to articulate or haven't articulated. So in that sense, it's been very fruitful and it's been fun. It's been a while since I've been in an old fashioned Twitter throwdown, so I'm kind of enjoying it.
Yeah, I mean, for myself here, I was actually off Twitter for a few days or so because I was watching the amount of time I was spending on the app because I have one of those timer things, and I'm like, okay. And then when I do come back on, I see all this stuff going on. I'm like, oh man. But the funny thing is that these conversations we need to have them. I mean, it's something that I've been sort of saying from the time that I started on YouTube is that how do we identify ourselves? Because even coming from my own point of view, I was born and raised in Canada. My parents are from the Caribbean, but yet in Toronto, we do have this global sort of Hindu diaspora. Yeah. And how is it that we're going to identify ourselves moving forward? And as I said, is that we are I do believe that we're on the beginning phases of trying to qualify, quantify, and be able to describe what does it mean to be whether an American Hindu or what I would like to say like a North American Hindu, because the differences between Canada and the US, there are some, but as a Hindu group, I do say a largely North American identity.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to jump into talking about this, but first, I really think it'd be helpful, Vishal, if you lay out what it is that you're actually arguing in your posts and what's your viewpoint on this is, because I think there's been a lot of people that have made their own conclusions from it, or they're as if you're saying we need to become Protestants. And
I'm a crypto person now. I don't know if
yeah. So why don't you lay out what your argument is here?
Yeah, so I think the real impetus was, and this is something that I think has been going on for a long time. I mean, I've been kind of tracking these issues for years now, and I think that obviously, as an immigrant group, in America, a fairly recent one, we're going through a inflection point, I would say. It's a kind of a pivotal period in the history of Indians in America, Hindus in America in particular. And we're seeing this upsurge in anti-Indian animus, and and obviously, I've been, I think you've been following this as well. I don't say this from a braggadocious standpoint, but I'm not really surprised to see what we're seeing now because we've seen the seeds of this planted, on the left for years now, sure. And it's we're seeing the kind of, those seeds that were planted are now blossoming into this more mainstream anti-Indian animus that we're seeing from the right. And I see this as, we can evaluate the causes for this, what's going on, what makes our situation unique. But I see this as, from a broader historical point of view, as something that basically every immigrant community has gone through. And it's something that's like a rite of passage, immigrant communities they achieve a level of public visibility and success in America, and there's always some sort of backlash. And there is kind of at its foundation, there's a very natural kind of curiosity, right? Like a lot of Americans have a lot of exposure to Hindus or Indians, and they see them in politics and media, tech, and highest echelons of American society. They're naturally going to be curious about who these people are, what their values are, what kind of culture they have. So I think that's a natural curiosity, but I think that our efforts to articulate that and to make our position known in American society, we face a lot of challenges. And I think one of the challenges that maybe is understated and one that we haven't confronted seriously enough is that the discourse is increasingly dominated by like a fringe on the American side and then Indians in India. And this sort of global Hindutva discourse has really just kind of colonized the whole discursive field. And I feel like in that context, the specific perspectives, experiences, views of second generation Hindu Americans who've grown up here, have roots in the society, like consider this their homes, is often not does not given fair representation. And so when I saw the original tweet was about this Usha Vance JD
Right.
the issue of like him saying that he wants his wife to convert. And the original tweet was the way I interpreted that is that was a transplantation of a very particular Indian political meme onto the American context, right? Like in India, they just kind of look at religious communities as these enclosed islands of people, and there's this long history in Indian politics of trying to maintain some semblance of harmony through these among these religious communities by maintaining this delicate demographic balance, by by clamping down on conversion and stuff like that. And for people in the West to adopt that framework and impose it and interpret what JD said about his wife through that and to be clear, like I think it was very uncouth for JD Vance to say that in public. Like I just don't think that's something that that's a personal thing you should figure out with your wife, But I don't think that the issue. I don't think his desire or his wish that his wife adopts his belief system from an American context. I saw that's totally natural to me. Like that's kind of how it works. Like you have a belief system. You're a believing Christian. This is kind of a universalist religious perspective, and naturally, you'd want your partner to share those views. But when I saw that tweet and I saw the very clear transplantation of an Indian ideological and political frame onto the American context, I honestly just got kind of fed up with it. And I think that it's just a huge impediment to Hindus in America having a productive discussion about our position in the society and the kind of society that we want to contribute to and the kind of identity we want to carve out for ourselves in that society. And I think that requires a understanding of the realities of American society, the roots of American culture and politics and religion, and understanding that these are not just like us wanting to be legible within this broader culture is not like an act of conversion or like surrender or submission. It's like, no, we want to be productive citizens who can engage in these debates and engage in these negotiations with other Americans in our communities, our neighbors, our cities, our states, our country. And so right. I what I really am trying to achieve through drawing this line is creating some clarity about the fact that their perspective doesn't define us, and we shouldn't let people who are plugged into that Indian ideological and political way of thinking, we shouldn't allow them to speak for us because they don't care. They don't seem to be sensitive or willing to acknowledge the nuances of our position. It's really just like they see us as an extension of their own political and ideological aims. And the minute you divert from whatever they see as like correct or right, then you get the floodgates open. So yeah, that's kind of how it started. Obviously, this plugs into and dovetails into a bigger intellectual project that I've been interested in for a while, the whole frontier dharma issue, which is obviously related to this. This is kind of downstream from, I think, the issue identified in that original essay. But that was the impetus for the original tweet, and that's kind of where I'm coming from in this debate.
Shawn, do you have any particular response comments to that?
I think you're on mute, Shawn.
Yeah, you're on mute.
So I do think we need to touch on that essay that you wrote, because that frames this entire debate, because a lot of people were trying to figure out where exactly you were going from this. And I did read your essay. And I think it's important to understand that, because one of the challenges that I see is the idea that Hinduism, Sanatan Dharma, is that, can it change? Will it change? Has it changed? And the point of view that I see from this is that I think we need to examine the histories of how it did change across, not just from myself, like from a West Indian point of view, but there's very clear examples of how it changed when it went to Southeast Asia, when it went to Bali, when it went to all of these that have a much longer history than my own. And I think if we don't examine those, then how is it that we're actually going to frame what we're doing here and how we see ourselves? So that was my first point. I think the interesting point that you raised is the one of growing up in a North American society. We are centered on whether it be in Canada and the US, about a society that was largely funded by that was founded by Protestant values, not necessarily like the religious aspect of it, but the exact structure of how the society functioned.
Exactly.
And when I look at my own history as a Caribbean Hindu, a lot of those structures is what had to change for us in Guyana, for those that, well, for my wife's family that's from there, for my own family that's from Trinidad. And when we came to Canada, because it was that same sort of environment, it was basically a transplant of how Hinduism adapted, how it changed, and how it was brought over here. So, like, one of the things that I do remember growing up here, and when we first encountered Indians from India, one of the the most simplest of things is that, okay, so we have a temple, we're going on a Sunday. For a West Indian Hindu, going temple on a Sunday, that's like the norm. Why? Because you grew up in a Christian environment, and that was the only day that you had to, from the sugarcane fields, from all the work. So when we came here, and my father and my parents and everyone from the first gen were trying to encourage Indian families to like bring their kids out, the first reaction you see is like, well, we don't do that. And even recently, in my conversations with a lot of the people that are trying to advocate for Hindus, when I mention this, the first answer that I get back is that, well, Hinduism doesn't require that. Yeah. Fine. Yeah. But then what is it that you're doing in a North American environment then? Because I'm more than willing to explore that. And I think that, that's just a simple example for myself. But in your essay, you touch on a lot of ways that, how is it that we reimagine the Hindu identity in North America? And I do have a few questions that I want to ask you, but that's sort of my framing of it, is that Hinduism has to adapt, and I think we're in a good place right now to sort of figure that out. And I mean, I don't claim to have any answers, and my own community has its own issues that we have to grapple with. But 100 years from now, is it going to be what the first gens brought here, or is it going to be something else? Yeah. And to just sideline any type of conversation on both sides, I think is not doing any help at all.
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe it would be helpful if I just briefly, I mean, that essay was quite long, and I think at times probably too academic, but I'll try to give like a basic summary of the argument I was making in that essay, which was titled "The Hindu Case Against Hinduism," for those who haven't read it. So yes, Shawn, I totally agree with you. And I think what I basically say is I diagnose this conservatism that you're talking about, this kind of unwillingness to have conversations about adaptation and about change. My motivation in that essay was trying to trace the intellectual genealogy of that attitude. Now, I think there is an intellectual aspect to it. There's also a more mundane cultural aspect, which I think is I've certainly observed. I'm sure you've observed it as well. But I think that when a lot of immigrants come to the West, there's this anxiety they have about losing connection with their culture. And so I remember even experiencing this when we'd go back to India, which was that, and family in India would make this observation. They'd say that the diaspora was more like the Indians in the diaspora were more traditional than Indians in India, because what happens is that the immigrants come here and they're really desperate to hold on to what they had. And they're removed from that kind of organic environment where culture and religion and spirituality evolve naturally. And they're put on an island where they are have to hold on with a tight grip onto the culture that they brought with them. And it becomes like it almost loses the spiritual significance, and it becomes more about a cultural connection. And I think that is negative, because what it does is it ossifies the tradition. It ossifies culture, and it turns it into like a fossil that you just preserve and look at like in a museum, but it's not actually living because it's not adapting to the society that you're in. So I think that's the cultural side of it. On the intellectual side, the reason I called it the Hindu case against Hinduism is because I argue that this conservatism or this bias towards traditionalism is built into our conception of what Hinduism is. And our conception of what Hinduism is that we've inherited was a product of a very specific historical, political, and intellectual process. And to quickly give a summary of this, as I understand it. So, and I think a lot of people who are pro-Hindu or advocates for Hindus really they really hate this argument, because I think the Indian left has really taken a scholarly argument and mutilated it for very parochial ideological ends. But when I say that, Hinduism was first used by a British guy in the late 18th century, it's a fact. That term Hinduism was used by an evangelical named Charles Grant in like the 1780s. Does that mean Hinduism was invented? This is what like the left will say. And then the Hindu right says, no, we're an ancient religion. We've been here for thousands of years. Like Hinduism goes back for whatever. But this binary, I think, obscures the more nuanced reality, which is that when, and this is the work of S.N. Balangangadhara, who is a professor at Ghent, who very interesting writer. He wrote The Heathen in His Blindness, and then Do All Roads to Lead to Jerusalem. And I really, I disagree with a lot of his solutions, but I think his diagnosis from a historical, intellectual history perspective is spot on, which is that when the British came to India and they saw Hindu civilization and they saw all of the spiritual activities or cultures that were in India, they conceptualized all of those spiritual activities, and not just spiritual activities, but everything, right? Everything was conceptualized as part of this religion of Hinduism. And when they created that conceptual structure, they imposed on it a kind of Christian superstructure, because the very concept of religion derived from a Christian source. So, I mean, you see the downstream effects of this even today, because when people try to communicate or define Hinduism in the public sphere in the West, they often talk about what Hindus believe, what our sacred texts are. They describe it in the public sphere as if it was a Christian religion. You see this like what Vivek did, right? I mean, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with his interpretation, what he's doing is, not new. Like this has been an intellectual struggle and puzzle that Hindus have been trying to navigate for 2 centuries. Is how to operate within the conceptual framework that we've been subjected to, or that's been imposed on us. So, we had this idea of religion, this idea of Hinduism as a religion. And when Indians themselves were introduced to this concept, you had like a bimodal approach. You had two schools. On one hand, you had reformists, and these are like the Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, even Vivekananda, thinkers like this, who said, okay, we have this new concept of religion. It's very important. Like all, big civilizations have religions. What we have to do is we have to take our spiritual heritage and we have to fundamentally restructure it to make it more like an actual religion. So like the Brahmo Samaj, for example, what they did is they, created a whole new sacred text. It was called the Brahmo Granth. And it was essentially like a mix of the Upanishads, some Puranic stuff. Right. And they created these like rules or creedal beliefs that every Brahmo Samaj member had to follow. They created a vow where every Samajist would have to basically pledge their loyalty as a Samajist first, then an Indian second. But they really tried to create this universal religion, much like Christianity, but with this with the Hindu content, Upanishadic content. So you had that effort going on, which ultimately was not successful because it was very Anglophilic. It was very detached from the masses of Indian society, and the average Indian couldn't relate to the philosophical ideals of the Brahmo Samaj. And what you had in reaction to this reformist move was an Orthodox reaction, which emerged from the same group, right? The Orthodox, both the reformists and the Orthodox, these were both basically Bengali Bhadralok, like high caste Bengalis who were working in the British administrative apparatus, who were getting English education taught by missionaries mostly. But you had an Orthodox reaction of people who saw themselves as opponents of both the reformists and the missionaries. And these Orthodox groups avoided any sort of articulation of what Hinduism was as a religion. They basically argued that Hinduism was an organic unity of all the different caste groups, traditions, ritual cultures, and all of those in their totality constituted Hinduism, the Hindu nation, whatever you want to call it. And so you had this back and forth between Orthodox people and reformists. And in the early 20th century, you had this sort of rough and tumble of Indian politics. And what happened was you had elites from all these different religious communities, Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus, and they were essentially lobbying the British government for political favor. And in order to do that, they had to say that they were representatives of a particular community. So this led to this whole fixation on how to define who belonged to what religion. And if you read the census reports from this period, it's really fascinating because no one knew what a Hindu was. And even like if you look at like with Muslims and Sikhs, right? Like there were Muslim communities who had very syncretic practices where they, worshipped Ram, or they would do like certain rituals at Sufi shrines or whatever. And Sikhs also very difficult to categorize one way or the other because a lot of them engaged in what we now consider Hindu practices. So you had census officials that were trying to determine who belonged to what religion. And then you also had elite members of each of these communities trying to create stricter delineations between communities. We still are suffering the consequences of this today. We're suffering, maybe that's a loaded term, but we're still dealing with the consequences of this today. But
right. If I can, I mean, it's okay if I interject here. Okay. So I think there's a couple interesting things going on here, right? I mean, obviously we have the historical element of what Hinduism is in what it broad strokes, right? Like you talk about Brahmo Samaj, and you have, Ramakrishna Math does its own thing now, and you have all these other traditions and sampradayas, right? I think the problem, I mean, going back to your point, and even what Bala Gangadhar kind of talks about, is this idea you see all these different traditions, they're all somehow connected, and then you just try to create this group and call that a religion. Yeah, right. That's really which each sampradaya has its own texts, its own like traditions, its own like practices that are very, very like insulated for them. And I think one of the problems I'm seeing is this desire for Hindus to, in some sense, universalize and kind of connect with other religions. We're just shoving it all together, saying this is us. And then when everyone looks at that it's contradictory. Those massive like different traditions and ideas, they're in many ways the total opposite of each other.
It's incoherent.
Yeah. And I think if that's the argument, and at least the historical argument that you're making about what Hinduism is and then kind of how it affects us, I think that's kind of point on.
Yeah, because I mean, just to finish that point, I'm almost at the end, is that, basically you had in the early 20th century, what happened was the whole reformist impulse was totally marginalized because you had this upsurge in communal violence in the 1920s, and the Orthodox faction in the Hindu Mahasabha, which was like an early representative body for Hindus, basically said, like, you guys are asking difficult questions. You want to deal with these complicated issues around caste, around, reconversion. That was a big issue in the early days. And frankly, it's alienating people from the community, and we need to just focus on building unity. So I think this conception of Hinduism or the Hindu community as being this organic totality of all these different groups with their own customs and rituals and traditions, that I think became the default view. And I think a lot of intellectually, if you look at the way that a lot of, trads, whatever you want to call them, the way they look at Hinduism, I think is in line with that Orthodox viewpoint, which is that, to be Hindu is just to be like in this little box where you follow this particular tradition, and you shouldn't divert from that because that disturbs this organic unity of all the different groups together. And that to me is just a tragic and catastrophic mistake. And it's one that, maybe you can understand the political context in the early 20th century, why they made that decision, or why that shook out the way it did. But I think that continuing along that vein and not reopening the debate that started, at the onset of the colonial era, I think now's the time. I mean, you have to deal with, modernity, like the forces of modernity. It's not a passing fad, like it's the universe that we live in, and you have to be able to articulate your values, your spiritual system, whatever you do, not just to make it legible to the broader society, but to make it legible for second generation people who grow up in the society and think in those terms. And I think that's ultimately there's a lot of inertia and discomfort in the Hindu community, because they are so fixated on the continuation of and the preservation of tradition as an end in and of itself.
Right. So if I can, so this is where I think it's actually kind of interesting. People have brought up Hare Krishna in these conversations and tweets. And I actually think for a large part, Hare Krishna in its earlier stage did not call themselves Hindu.
They still don't.
They still don't. Yeah.
And the thing is, I think that's, and many times Hindus, I mean, I use this term again very broadly, get upset about that, because part of this is, I think, our own sense of, well, in India, they have their own reasons, right? Because then it's like a voting block. It's like when people call themselves Hindu in India, as opposed to, let's say, I'm Shaiva Siddhanta or Lingaites, right? This was a war between Lingaites in India and other Hindus was, are you Hindu or not? Because these terms matter to them politically and for power there. But in America, I feel like, I don't know how that matters that much anymore here, right? Like if you do call yourself, like, I mean, I think we internally use the term Hindu to understand each other, but maybe the thing is we got to use our particular tradition. I belong to X, and we have a view on this, and that view is what we're going to push and discuss, and not everything else, right? Like, and I think part of this movement, especially in the diaspora, and then we'll go to you guys about this, is how, because we are in an individualistic country, and the West is very much about, like, what is it you believe? What is it that your tradition holds particularly? And I think here is where we have to, like, maybe change a little bit from India in the way Hindus in India approach Hinduness versus here. Shawn, and then Vishal.
So I do get that argument, but my question back to you is there not any overarching unity between the various streams of thought, which is I think what the nature of those that want to argue the unity in Hinduism is what they always fall back on, is that yes, there are different ways that everyone approaches what they conceptualize as the divine, but is there not an underlying unity that we here, in North America, if we do want to latch onto that sort of idea, that we cannot also frame it in that way while still allowing for it? Or are we just defaulting back onto the individual like the individual person choosing what their own tradition is?
I think there's for sure like broad unity, right? There's for sure like philosophical continuity, and there's like a shared kind of Puranic encyclopedia that people draw from. The stories, right? I mean, the stories are really, I think, at the core of Hindu civilization, like going to the Ramayana or the Mahabharata and taking stories from that, taking philosophical expositions on the Puranas, taking the Upanishads. These are all common ground that can serve as a basis for discourse. But I think what happens is that the actual substance of those similarities is often neglected in favor of just grouping everything into this category of Hinduism. And we have this sort of inclusivist, I call it inclusivism. It's not a term I invented. It was actually a term that was used derisively by a scholar named Paul Hacker. He was a German Indologist who was a very ardent Christian. And he was a very ardent critic of what he called the neo-Hinduism. But I do think that it's something that an attitude I see, right? We just kind of dismiss or underplay the fact that a lot of these traditions have divergent philosophical ideals, divergent conceptions of the divine, and we just kind of mindlessly group them all under this category of Hinduism. And then what happens is that you sometimes have people who take their own particular version and they project it as the normative ideal, right? I mean, I talk about in that essay, the example of this 2005 California textbook controversy, which I think is it's a very interesting episode in diasporic history, and I think it's very rich for analysis when you think about the challenges that we face today. Because basically, then you had these parent groups in California who, the public schools every year, or every few years, I don't know how often, but they review the school textbooks and they allow a public comment period where parent groups and whatever advocacy organizations can come in and say, hey, this material is not correct. Here's what you should do instead. And so the textbook, had the standard, Hinduism has a caste system, this is like a pyramid, whatever. And these parent groups came in and they said, this is incorrect. You should use this material instead. And the material they presented said, Hinduism is a monotheistic religion. Caste is a cultural practice, not a religious practice. Hindus are not really polytheist, which was emphasized in the original version. So you have this activist group and these parent groups trying to present a particular vision of Hinduism that they're projecting as normative, that they're projecting as the real thing. And yet anyone who's a Hindu knows, like, that's not true. Like, you can't make that claim legitimately, knowing that there are many Hindus who would say, I'm absolutely believe in multiple gods. Like, that's not, there are people who have that view. And it's like, I think that these debates are too often, I think this almost this obsession people have about unity often comes at the expense of critical reflection on the nature of what that unity actually is. And I would rather have, a fragmented traditions that can have honest discussions about, their perspectives and where they unite and where they differ, versus the sort of fake, we're all Hindus, we all have the same religion of Hinduism. And it's just ultimately not in accord with the ground reality. And so I get frustrated when, we run into the same issue over and over again, because it's like conceptually we were off the tracks at the very beginning, in my view. And I think you have to course correct and rethink from the ground up how you conceive of Hindu tradition, I think.
So I'll just give you an example just from the history from the Caribbean. So that exact problem that you described was the same issues that Hindus in Trinidad in particular faced when they had to start advocating for themselves. Is that they realized is that there were so many different diverse traditions, but as a whole, in order to coalesce as one group, they really had to figure out how is it that we're going to do that, and it led to the formation of the Sanatana Dharma Mahasabha, where they literally like prescribed, these are the rituals that we are following. This is how it's going to be followed, so that you can't say that we are not an organized religion, which then actually led to the formation of branches of mandirs, like they're literally called SDMS branch, the Sanatana Dharma Mahasabha branch number 124, branch number 153. So that this organization of it was actually forced because of the nature of the environment that they were in. My question though is that was for that time because of what they were facing. Do you think that's something that we will eventually have to face, or do you think that because of the individual nature of who we are right now, that we can have both sides in it, is that we can preserve the diverse traditions of Hinduism, but at the same time coalesce as one organized group for the purposes of whatever we want to advocate for ourselves? Because I think if we go down one path, that we're going to be at odds with each other. That's sort of where my thinking is right now.
I think that in the American context, I think it's not feasible or realistic or even desirable for people to think that they can maintain like ethnic traditions in the long run, because I think that I think that point you make about Trinidad is super interesting. I would love to read more about exactly that process and how that worked, and I think it's very interesting. But I do think that we have to be sensitive to the nuances of each diasporic situation. And I think America is such a unique example because the particular nature of how the immigrants were selected to come here in the first place, how immigrants were geographically dispersed, the level of economic and educational achievement means that Hindus here tend to be go through very like elite institutions. They work in very competitive jobs, and they're immersed in the elite American culture, which I think is notwithstanding kind of recent turns towards tribalism, is still very individualistic at its core. So I think that you really have to any sort of sustainable Hindu identity in America has to be based on a sort of voluntary association. It has to be you have to be able to communicate Hindu values in a way that is appeals to everyone. It has to be universalist in its outlook, which is why I think ISKCON is such a good example, because one of the I think one of the reasons why ISKCON was able to succeed, right, is because Prabhupada came here in the 60s. He basically avoided all of the toxic political and parochialism in India. And we shouldn't underplay how much resistance he faced. Like a lot of the traditional Gaudiya Vaishnav mutts were very anti Prabhupada when he started to get adherents in the West. They saw what he was doing as they saw what he was doing as divergent, and it was like deviant, and he was corrupting the Gaudiya Vaishnav theology. But he came here and he specifically had a mission of communicating Krishna Bhakti to the West, and even though ISKCON is very traditionalist in its frame, they do the deity worship, they're very emphasis on puja, they're very they seek to restore Vedic culture. That's really their mission, but they reframed it in a way that it was explicitly. It was extroverted in its approach, and they didn't see themselves as we're an Indian religion. There's no, we're Krishna Bhakti, and we're here to find adherents in the West for this universal religion, this universal spirituality. Mm-hmm. And I think that to me is I have issues with ISKCON in particular, but I think that if you think about their approach in the abstract, I think that is really we can take a lot of inspiration from. What not only what Prabhupada did when he came to America, but how ISKCON continues to appeal to a very wide swath of Americans, regardless of their ethnic background.
Yeah, and I think a good portion of that is also because I think they reinterpreted a lot of the text to fit a more universal kind of background. Like, for example, with in the Indian traditions, for the most part, your Varna Jati is descent, right? Yeah. Like your family or whatever it is, right? But the problem is in the West, no one knows what they are. Mm-hmm. So when you come in, he just made everyone, whatever, and just told them to follow these particular rules. It's very easy. And I think I'm not easy in the sense of like practice, but just easy to grasp in your head. I think sometimes what I think a lot of people, I guess in India, maybe more so don't understand, and maybe even our first generation people, is they don't get that for second generation, this is a marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
We're constantly in a place where we have to somehow justify our beliefs. We didn't come prepackaged with it, right? In the sense of from the moment we're kids, we're in the house, parents teach us something, we go outside, we learn something entirely different, and they're kind of juxtaposed against each other constantly, like warring. So the difficulty has been, I think, for many of the second generation is to figure out how do we talk about whatever it is we're doing, and what is it we're like, because going to Bala Vihar, like most of the times, and I went to Bala Vihar, like I don't know if you guys did, but so you learn, like Jai Ganesha, you learn like shlokas, you learn some stories, you learn that kind of stuff, but there's no sense of what that actually means, right? Like, for example, when you go to a Christian church, and I'm not saying, I'm saying this is a very smart move. Every Christian child knows that there's a narrative built into the story of Christianity that has a direct impact on their life. Like for example, like Jesus died for our sins. Mm-hmm. It's small, succinct, and it's easy for them to believe. And a part of me is like, for us to compete in this world, I'm not saying we have to have that easy, but there's got to be something we got to say. Why be Hindu? What's interesting about being Hindu? Like, and I think sometimes the first, if you talk amongst ourselves, everyone knows we're culturally, like, we have that foundation that
Mhm.
you know it's very easy to talk about. Oh, I believe Vishishta Advaita. Oh, I believe Advaita. Then you could just some of this stuff.
Yeah.
But like in the world in America, that's almost unheard of.
Yeah, and I think one thing that really frustrates me, and I'm going to use the derisive term "fobs," what really annoys me is that there's a sort of sense that tradition is self-justifying, you know,
Sure.
and tradition is it's self-justifying, and if you divert from it, then that somehow like it's a failure to understand, and you have to be Uncle Splained back into sanity. You know, this is the basic. This is the first line of defense is that. Oh, you just don't understand the beauty of our rituals. You don't understand the scientific nature
tell me,
of tradition, huh? But it's even those explanations I just find so like they're patronizing, and they're most of the time they're very stupid, right? Like I just have no interest in hearing like I don't like this sort of rational ex post facto rationalist or scientific justification for religious rituals like that. I'm not interested in that.
Yeah,
like,
but I think that's any tradition does that. Christians do that, right?
Yeah,
Like I mean, like the Catholic Church is tradition justifies itself, right?
but
It's there.
But yeah, but it's also different, right? Because you have again, I mean, this is the fundamental difference is that if you're the basis of your religion is you have some divine revelation, there is going to be a much more there's going to be much more emphasis on sticking to this original message. Obviously there are disagreements and there's a whole hermeneutics of how to interpret biblical language or whatever. But I think that a lot of times these rationalizations are a substitute for thinking about how to make the spirituality relevant to people living in this social and political reality. And I think that the sort of reflexive attempt by not all, but a lot of, but some first generation people to immediately put the blame on the second generation, I find that like offensive, and I find it. I'm kind of.
Can you give an example of that?
I mean, this is just been my experience. I mean, I think that if you look at I even experienced this in some of the replies, right? Like referring, someone was like, "This is a privileged second generations not appreciating the traditions that their parents passed down to them." It's like this is just reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how we grow up in this country and how we look at this stuff. Like it's not, and it's also a very classic sort of parental guilt trip. Which I'm sure a lot of second generation people can relate to. It's just it doesn't jive with the worldview of the second generation Hindu American, which is make the case. We have to make the case. That's not just between first and second generation, but it's between Hindus and broader society. I think there's this fear that is somehow constitutes like a surrender or a submission. It's like no, like this is how traditions grow. Like this is exactly how traditions stay alive. Is that you take them into a new context and you figure out what makes them relevant in the world that you inhabit at that time.
So
go ahead, Shawn.
Yeah. So let's delve into that a little bit more. So first gens came. My parents were of that generation. They came to Toronto. They built mandirs. That's the environment that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's fair on them to be able to adapt who they were to the environment that we grow up in? Because our way of understanding the world is not going to be their way of understanding it. And I think where I would push back a little bit on that is that the second gen themselves haven't taken it upon themselves to express themselves what is it that they need. Now, I do know the argument that when they do try to say that our questions are not being answered or things that they're always sidelined by the uncles, right? So I do understand that. I have lived that. But I also have to say is that I find that we ourselves, and I say we as like second gens, we haven't pushed enough to take ourselves out of our comfort zone, right, to try to understand what is it that we are trying to adapt and who is it that we really are. Because to get to that level requires your own type of sadhana to understand the traditions that you are a part of. And I do find that we're going to find ourselves in this vicious loop, is that we want to be able to express ourselves, but we don't have the knowledge to do it. And who do you go to that knowledge for? Well, you have to go back to the first gens or the traditionalists. And we're in this ever, this loop is that. So how do we break out of it if we ourselves are not willing to push the boundaries? And I'm not saying this is you, but the wider second gens? Because I haven't seen it, and I don't know if it will eventually come, or are we going to be reliant on this immigration wave to constantly do it? And if that's the case, then I think we're out to lunch.
Yeah. First of all, I don't blame the first generation for doing what they did. I think they did what was natural and what made sense to them. And, you know, I think that like the conceptual, I mean, one of the examples I talk about in my essay is this, you know, one of the first temples Hindu Americans built here was the Pittsburgh temple. It's a famous temple. And it was built as a replica of Tirupati in Andhra Pradesh. And, you know, the temple as an institution is fundamentally different from the mosque or the church, just in its conception, right? Like it's not a sort of a it's not a congregational place of worship that's made to be transplanted across all these different boundaries. Like the temple is integrated into a very specific symbolic language. So if you take Tirupati for example, right? Like there's the story of Tirupati is that Vishnu wanted a resting place where he would be more easily able to assist the devotees during the Kali Yuga. And so this Shesha, cosmic serpent, lies down on the hill. The hills of Tirumala are supposed to be the serpent, and then the temple sits on top of the serpent where Vishnu is at rest. So this is like the sacred geography of India. And when devotees go there, they know this. It's something that's in the air they breathe. They know the story. They know what the hills are. They know what the temple represents. And then you had Hindu immigrants that came here, and they just took the temple that meant a lot to them, and they created a replica in the hills of Pittsburgh. And there's a very clear disconnect there, because you take your American-born kids to the temple, and they've been taken out of that water, that environment. So they no longer have access to that symbolic language. They don't understand. They see the iconography of the temple, and they see it in isolation, divorced from the cultural, linguistic, and mythological foundations that exist in India. And so this has been the standard, this has been the standard pattern, I think, in the diaspora, where you have these immigrant groups that come here and they just build what they know. And I don't blame them for it. I mean, this is, a difficulty that's inherent in Hindu tradition. But what I do, find annoying is that there's seems to be a refusal to course correct when the evidence is mounting that their approach has failed, right? I mean, like, we know this is maybe the situation in Canada is different, but I can tell you that in the American context, and I'm around Hindu Americans, second generation Hindu Americans, my peer group every day. I can't name a single person who is an adult, who grew up in America, who goes to the temple like on their own volition to engage in puja or do rituals, including me. I mean, I don't go either, but sure. When people will go for the big festivals, they'll go when their parents are in town or whatever. But there's just this massive disconnect between the temple as an institution, the first generation people who run it, and the second generation. And this has been the case for decades. And, there has been basically no systemic attempt to introspect on why this failure exists and why, and what can be done to rectify it. And I think that's where it gets a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, and I get your point, but I think there's a couple of things that I'm going to push back on, because I do think, for example, moving of the temple, from in the sense of taking it from India, bringing it here, there is inherent value there outside of just simply like it's a replica. There's within the confines of that temple, there is the language, there is the traditions, there is the community. The temple serves a very good purpose, frankly, even in America. Like, I grew up on temples, right? And I'm sure Shawn did too, like, in some sense. I went to temple all the time. My dad was one of the guys foundational for the Malibu temple. We went to ISKCON temples. We went to all these temples all the time. And that's because the first generation, their lives were intertwined with that, right? Their communities, their culture, all that stuff. Now, that being said, my generation, like, I go to temple decently regularly, right? But my sisters don't, except for festivals, but they do other things, for example, that keep them Hinduized, which might be dance, music, these cultural elements that do similar things that a temple does, right? And they go to temple, they perform at temples, So I think the temples absolutely serve a purpose, and they serve a good purpose. The one area where I do think that, Shawn and I discussed this last time, is there is this, I think it's twofold. Part one, my generation, our generation, has failed to step up to engage in preserving and maintaining our traditions, our like ideas. Number two, I think there has been a failure on the first generation from passing on the baton, and kind of in some sense like letting the second generation growing up here influence and grow the temple community or the cultural community. And I think this is, and part of this might be course correction, maybe our children's children, I don't know, but like there's a sense where many of us became less Hindu in the outward way because we became more white in some sense, more American, right? More vanilla in the context of like the way we live, the way we interact. Like I'm in an interracial marriage, so that changes some dynamics here. I teach the kids stuff. I have murtis at home. All that plays a role, but it's not going to be the same as it is with my parents. Or
when you, yeah, I certainly won't be the same. But when you say that the second generation hasn't stepped up to continue the traditions, what would you expect them to do that? Like, because I think that is the first generation view is probably like the second generation doesn't care. But see, I think this is where the disconnect is, because I think you can look at the second generation and see like, why isn't the second generation coming to temples and taking more of an interest in these rituals, taking more interest in these traditions? But if the traditions don't speak to the second generation, where in the context that they live and in the world that they inhabit, then why would you expect them to go out of their way to, I think on a very basic level, I feel like I'm just a pragmatist. Mm-hmm. And like the fundamental test for a religious belief or a spiritual system that you want to transmit to the next generation, or that you want to transmit over the next several generations, is that it fundamentally has to provide a value for that person's life, and it has to contribute to them flourishing in life, right? And I think that at the base level, you have to fulfill that goal. And then if you fulfill that goal, then you can build a ritual culture around it. Like, for example, I think one thing that, to go back to ISKCON, that they do really well is that they've established these things called bhakti centers. There's one in New York, there's one in LA, I think there's one in San Francisco. And what they've done, because they were going through the same issue, because again, ISKCON is fairly trad, at least aesthetically, ritually, and they were finding that it was very hard for them to attract American adherents. They were getting a lot of Indian devotees, obviously. It's just natural for Indian immigrants, but they were having a lot of trouble finding Americans, and the reason why is because the ritual culture, it was just so foreign to Americans. So what they did was they were like, okay, let's establish these bhakti centers. And what is the bhakti center? The bhakti center is basically like you go in and it's like a yoga studio, and they have kirtan, they have meditation classes, they might teach a Gita class or whatever. But what they do is they first build this sense of community around activities that are relatable to the average American who grew up here, who inhabits that worldview. And then once they are ingratiated into that community, and once they feel like they're part of this community, then they're like, okay, well, if you want to go to the next level, why don't you come upstairs and we'll show you how we do the deity worship and the puja and all this stuff. So that to me is really the sort of the failure at temples. It's I think it's unfair just to say why aren't these second generation kids coming in here and continuing these traditions and these rituals, because you're assuming the value to the second generation not exist. And I think it's incumbent on the Hindu community, if you want people to take an interest in this stuff, you have to somehow show them that, like, look, there's real value here in your life on a day-to-day basis. Like there's a real sense of community, or like mindfulness, whatever you want to call it. And that's the kind of adaptation that I think is really missing, and it's really important. And I think that is maybe it's hard for, I think the first, what I hope to open up this conversation is like, the first generation needs to understand, or at least try to see these things from the second generation's perspective, growing up in this society, inhabiting the world that we do.
So Shawn, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think, from my perspective, I can see a clear separation between those that are like a West Indian Hindu versus those that are the Indian Hindu, because all of the problems that you speak about, West Indians did try to address that. Because when you talk about does this bring value to my life? What is my entry point? Because a question that everyone needs to ask yourself: what is your entry point into a Hindu life? For the West Indian, we were separated from India, so there wasn't any type of like WhatsApp or internet like that, and the way Hinduism got transferred was literally through bhakti. So when you talk about bhakti centers through ISKCON, like any West Indian, whether it be myself, music, bhajans, kirtan, that was simply your entry point. And that I think is how the culture was able to transmit itself. The problem that I see, though, is that is not apparent in those that are from India, because they don't have the means to pass it on. Because for us, that mandir was the community center. That is where you brought your family. That is where you met your friends and all of that. And you bring them in there, and your son learns to play the tabla, your daughter learns to dance, and you get together. That same system was then transplanted here, and now it's almost like these kirtan groups that have formed within West Indian mandirs now are like your church choir. And parents see that as the entry point. And I think where I see, because in that essay that you wrote, you mentioned how like you used to go and used to end up in the parking lot or doing something like that. And you see it all the time. And I see it all the time whenever I visit mandirs that are largely Indian based, is that there's a disconnect from what the parents are doing and what the kids are doing. Whereas I find from my own background, our parents were not these traditionalist Hindus, because we didn't have that. We had a very specific way that we performed our pujas and what we did, and that is what got transmitted. And I'm not saying that it was perfect, because it's not. But my question is that for yourself, what would you have liked to see change growing up? Because I think in the Twitter threads is that those were some of the things that people were wanting to know, is that knowing, like, hindsight being 2020, what would have changed to make things different for you right now?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that, one of the things that always appealed to me, or I think a lot of second generation people can relate to this, is I was never really drawn to the ritual culture, to be frank. I mean, it never really appealed to me. It was always the stories. The stories were what, and I'm sure maybe Shawn, I'm sure you grew up with these, but like the Amritsar Katha comics, right? Those were like a huge part of my childhood, and the Rajaji, the Rajagopalachari, Mahabharata, and Ramayana, right? These stories were so important, and I think that again, I mean, it's hard to say, but I think that really emphasizing the importance of those stories, adapting those stories, making them relevant to your daily life is a huge. That's a I think that would have been a huge plus. And I think that in some ways we ended up doing that, because we did have these comics and we did have these, but it was never really institutional. It was just all stuff that we do on our own, like at our own house, or so that's one thing. But I just it's an interesting question. But I think that there was the very vivid memory, like it was like two different worlds, that we didn't. We go to these temples, and I just remember like we'd be playing basketball in the parking lot, and they like, and we're literally inhabited a different world, like you look into what they were doing, and like the movements would be like you didn't even know what they were doing, right? Like the very particular way in which they prostrate, or where they circumambulate, like you look at this from the outside, and sometimes you'd follow them and follow along, but it was always done in an imitative way, And I think the natural first generation response is to we just have to explain why we do the things that we do. But even that, I don't know if that goes far enough, because I think that the way in which the first generation and the second generation even think about something like tradition are fundamentally different. Like, I do think that a lot of the first generation do see tradition as something that is worth preserving in and of itself. And I think that is a very fundamentally different worldview than the average second generation Hindu American. I don't feel that way at all about tradition. Like, I think there are things that can be learned from tradition. I think there's like an anthropological interest I have in certain Hindu traditions. But I don't see it as something that needs to be preserved for its own sake. I see that as like a preservation of like a fossil, you know, like I for me, it's, you know, and this is where I really draw on the works of like Radhakrishna, you know, the Hindu view of life. He makes this point. J.L. Mehta, who's a philosopher I quote in that essay. But tradition, you know, to me exists in this dialectic between, you know, you have tradition, but if that tradition doesn't speak to your life and the way that you look at the world, then it doesn't really mean much to me. And so
Right.
you know, so I think there's like there's for sure like practical things that I think could have been done better. But I also think part of it is just a fundamental rethinking of the role of tradition in the Hindu diaspora and what role that it plays. And I think that is maybe a more difficult conversation, but a more important one.
Well, I mean, just on that point, it seems to me you come from a very utilitarian perspective on the nature of like ritual and life and impact, right? Like I come from a different perspective. I think the rituals are worth preserving. I think not only they're worth preserving, they're important to preserve. But I also think there's elements that should change, right? You know, and you know, like for example, I do my sandhya and do my prayers and stuff, and that's important to me. Now I don't do it the way my dad did. My dad did it for 2.5 hours every morning. I maybe do like 20.
You're a slacker, dude. You're a slacker.
Yeah, I'm a total slacker. I maybe do it for like 20, 30 minutes. And then my rituals are different every day because it depends on my timing. But I will say this, part of this is like, I think the ritual aspect is important, but it seems to me like, have you been to the Self-Realization Fellowship in like LA? Ever?
Is that the Yogananda?
Okay. That's the Paramahangsa Yogananda one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been there a couple times, and so they are Hindu, but they're very much like a church. You come in, there's queues, you sit, they do like I guess a sermon, and then there's like a couple prayers, and then everyone goes off and does stuff. And so I actually think, you know, some of that should be implemented as like a very like entry level kind of like engagement into Hindu thought. I think it's important to build that on. And then like the temple structure as in terms of ritual, again, a lot of the stuff that happens at a temple and for rituals isn't necessary for most human beings, right? Like most Hindus don't go to temple for ritual. They go to temple for darshan. The rituals are done at home or taught by your parents. And I do think a lot of second generation Hindus that have been taught still do some mantras or bhajans or whatever it is at their own pace and at their own time. But I think in this particular context, yeah, I will take your perspective, and I think that's fair, which is, you know, we have to have an entry point that lets people that want to engage with Hinduism at not necessarily the fully ritualistic level and not necessarily the temple level, but something like, I mean, maybe it is a chapel level. I don't know. I mean, I think that's something that it'd be nice to go into a mandir or a whatever and have, you know, people talk to you about what does this mean to Gita? Why is this important? Right? You know, because I think that kind of like Bible study that they do in Christianity and even Islam does it, like we don't have that also to bind us here. And I think that's something that can be important. Yeah, Shawn, you have a point?
Yeah, so I mean, all of those points that you raised, those things are happening now. I mean, I can't speak to the U.S. context, but I can certainly speak to what's happening here, and I think all of those, you know, all of those things that we want to import, as we see, you know, those that are Christian are doing, certainly has value to what we can bring to the Hindu experience. When you try to bring this up to Indians from India, you're usually met with like, we don't have to do that because that's not who we are. But things like Gita study, like meditation centers or anything like that, does certainly bring value. And now I would say from my own perspective, I do see value in pujas. I do see value in rituals, but I also see the problem in just focusing on that. So this is a story from a friend of mine. So she's Guyanese Hindu. She's in her early 30s right now. And I mean, she grew up as a typical Guyanese Hindu, meaning that you went mandir once, typically once a week, and you listen to a pundit sit on the asan, and you would, give his quote unquote sermon, every week, and that was her relation to what being Hindu was. It was a once a week thing. Now, for a Guyanese Hindu, this is the norm. When she got older, she realized how much more Hinduism was because she got exposed to Vedanta. And then she's coming to talk to me about it. And she's like, how come we were never taught this? And I said, this is some of the challenges that we have within the West Indian community, because we're so focused in this little box that we have that it, I'm not going to crap on it because there's value to it, but there's certainly value in some of the other things. And then I can also see the flip side. There are those who only want to focus on Vedanta, but then they lose some of the emotional aspect of it too, which I think is also necessary. And I think, my own perspective on this entire debate is that I think we are going to come up with our own flavor of Hinduism. I don't see that in any other way. And I think conversations like this are certainly necessary so that we can actually bring those ideas to the forefront. Because when I was speaking about this thing back when even I was on YouTube in 2016, 2017, everyone would kind of talk to me like,
I didn't know you've been doing it for that long.
Yeah. Like one of my most highest performing videos was like why understanding a West Indian Hindu. And I ended that video off with a question: is that like 50 years from now, am I going to be a Canadian Hindu? Am I going to be a Trini Hindu? Or is it going to be some sort of like just Hindu? And the problem that is that we're not talking about it. And I don't know how we bring the conversation forward. Is that we have to understand is that all of this would adapt. It will have to change. And what I don't want to see happening, though, is that it just becomes this sort of like uniform way of approaching it, because I think all the little flavors that we have is beautiful. I mean, I sincerely appreciate it. And I don't want to see that lost. But so my one pushback that I will have on this is that what's the timeline for these adaptations? Because when we look at, like, historically speaking, to say that it's going to happen within one generation without some sort of external force pushing you there, is it going to happen? And even when I look at my own history, there were external forces, but that still took 100 years. And if you look at Bali, how Hinduism changed there, that's not something that happened like recently. So my question is it fair to expect things to change right now, or do we just make incremental progress towards something and then we see where it ends up?
Yeah. So my whole objective with this whole dialogue and even my essay is to free people from the intellectual straitjackets that are preventing us from asking these questions. Like, you asked me, like, how long is it going to take? I have no idea. But I do know that we'll make a lot more progress if people feel free to ask these questions and to really question things, even at the root, even at the risk of offending a lot of people like I have. Because I think it's very important. Like, I think we have to be more willing to offend. I think that there's a lot of, like, in Indian culture, I'm sure it's the same West Indian culture, but like this sort of culture of filial piety, which there's a lot of good to it. Like, it's good to respect your elders. It's good to love your parents and take care of them. But I find the sort of expectation that we just defer to our parents' generation and all these issues, I find it repugnant. And I say that as an American, like, it's just not in my DNA. It's just to, like, take whatever they tell us and say, oh, okay, you know, you're older, you must know, you're from India, you know Sanskrit, you must know. It's like, that doesn't appeal to me at all. Like, at the end of the day, what I want to encourage second generation people to do, who, and I think it is urgent, because I just know I've been around these people my whole life and I know how alienated they are. I know how indifferent they are. I mean, I would say 95% of Hindus in the second generation in America are cultural Hindus, which means that they don't actually engage with these issues on any sort of deep level. They just will go celebrate the festivals. And again, I'm not blaming them. I'm saying this has been happening for a while.
Reality, yeah.
But they will celebrate the festivals. They like the food. They'll wear the kurta and the sari or whatever. And so, I think that right now, I think this recent upsurge in anti-Indian animus, we can bitch and moan about it, but I see it as a great opportunity, because now people are really being forced to ask themselves, we're I'm being attacked for who I am or who they think I am. Well, now I really have to define myself. I really have to think about what my role in the society is. So I think it's a golden opportunity for people to ask these questions and think from first principles about what it means to be a torchbearer of Hindu civilization in America in 2025. And really, my objective with that essay and the dialogue over the weekend was to open people's minds to this perspective, and really just to help people understand that there's nothing, everything that all the attitudes and the views that we take as normative are just contingent. They're historically contingent, they're politically contingent, they're culturally contingent, and we are totally free to question them, and we're totally free to reformulate what it means to be Hindu in America. And so that's really my objective, because I think that if we are able to build, communities of second generation people who are interested in this question, who are willing to get together and have these discussions and talk about them, and really think free from the constraints of tradition and the expectations of the first generation, but just among us, like as second generation people who have this love for, this loyalty to Hindu civilization, and this conviction that Hindu philosophical thought and dharmic thought more broadly has something not just to offer to our lives, but has something to offer to the world. I think it's really up to us to think about it, in terms that make sense to us. So that's really my objective with all of this, is just to get people to, take off the intellectual straitjacket and just really, go wild with it, and let's see what comes out of it.
I will say a couple things here. So one, I think this is well needed, but I think the problem is it's only engaged with by first gen. Let's just reframe.
That's not true. I'll tell you, over the past weekend, the number of new second generation Hindu American followers I've gotten who have just been in my DMs telling me like, oh my God, like this is exactly how I feel. Like, thank you for articulating this. Like, I've never but I think that there is like a latent, like, I think there's a huge appetite for it.
But there's feeling. What I'm saying, there's a feeling around it. But there's not been engagement in the sense of like. So I think the second gens, and this is, a problem amongst our second gen is we historically have not been very openly and vocally Hindu, right? In any real sense, like except for a small, tiny contingent of us, like you said, 95% of us tend to do the holidays. They'll go do the Garba Dras or temple once in a while.
Hindu to what end? If it can't even be defined, why would people define?
Well, no. What I mean is like even growing up, like how often did you ever talk about your tradition or your faith to others outside your own, like outside your family and friends? Your small group.
Never.
And I remember going to church. I used to go to church. I used to be taken to by my friends because all my friends are Christian. So if I spend the night, they go to church in the morning, I go with them. I see, and then they have questions, and a lot of times I didn't have answers because I didn't know.
We didn't have the vocabulary for it. This is exactly the problem, right? It's a failure. It's a failure to translate. And
as we become adults, you're in law school. I met a lot of Indians, as you probably did, and you go whatever, and you talk to them about Hindu stuff. They don't have much to contribute, right? Like outside of like, hey, went to temple. Yeah, there's Diwali. It's coming up. Blah 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 blah. Right? There's nothing about anything more than that, right? So it's very much a culture Hindu, like you said.
Yeah.
But I think that is a problem that we have dealt with, and I don't know how much it can be. The parents, they didn't know what they didn't know, right? Ultimately, they didn't know how to address that with us. But now we're getting a sense of what this means, and this is where I tend to, I very strongly agree with you, is for people that want to stay in the U.S. and the West, the second generation has to lead, has to figure out what that identity is. We could still have the first gen, have the temples, rituals, all that stuff. We could go to them for those things, and that's going to be. It's not as if first gen is going to stop coming in the next 10 years. They're going to keep coming.
Man.
Right?
You never know. We had one Asiatic Exclusion Act. We could always get another. Who knows?
Yeah, but I think that's a whole different world, the globalized world that we have today. So it's a little different. But you're fair enough. It's possible. So I do think there is this sense of like our generation hasn't had the words, hasn't had the language, and has not maybe even the ability to desire to do so. And I think their kids are where we're trying to address.
For sure.
In some sense.
And Yeah, and that's what it's all about. I mean, I think that's really, I think you hit on a key issue, which is this, the lack of vocabulary. There is this sort of very fundamental asymmetry between what you might call the Indic worldview or whatever and the modern Western worldview. And I think that for too long, we've just thought of Hindu tradition as its own cloistered world that had its own idioms, its own language, its own concepts. And then the rest of our lives, we lived in this Western world where we, were deeply embedded in this rationalistic, scientific, materialist worldview. And I think that there's this gaping void between them. And I think that we need to, and I agree with it, it's totally incumbent on the second generation as people who are embedded in that world to find a way to translate that thought, dharmic thought, to our context. And I would just say that to undertaking that project, I think requires a willingness to just leave tradition behind, to just dive into the waters of the unknown and just.
I wouldn't say leave tradition behind. I feel like confront tradition and engage with tradition in like an intellectual way, right?
Yeah,
like
for sure.
And this is the point, is like when I look at the Hindu leaders, and Shawn, please, if I'm talking too much, you interrupt me and you jump on it. But like what I see is the Hindu leaders in the West are, again, first generation.
Yeah.
Like I don't see too many second generation leaders, or whether it's going to be institutional leaders or thought leaders, right? And I think that's a problem. Like if we don't have, and I think some of us are coming up, and I'm not going to say I'm a leader, I'm just a guy that does a podcast, but like there's something that needs to be done in our generation that's got to push our generation, maybe in our 40s, 50s, 60s, to become more interested in this in some sense. And go ahead, Shawn.
Sorry, I think part of the problem is that we haven't been forced out of our bubble that we've grown up in. I mean, that's just sort of the reality, is that we grew up in a comfortable life. We had everything met for us. We didn't have the struggles that our parents had to go through. So a lot of what I see is a lot of apathy on people from my generation. Now, where things have started to change, and again, this is just within my circle, is that people having family and kids and all of that, they are now starting to look in the mirror and trying to figure out for themselves, what is it that I am going to transmit on to my kids now. So I mean, having children certainly does change someone's world perspective. The interesting thing is that in my classes that I teach at the temple, so you were talking about Bal Vihar and stuff. So yeah, I've been teaching since 2012. But a lot of the things that you said is true. I had a parent reach out to me 2 weeks ago on Instagram saying that she went to her Bal Vihar class and she was trying to tell them that we need to do more than just mantras and shlokas, and we need to talk about some of the challenges that Hindus are facing, like what is our story, and you spoke about the narrative, but it was met with like a brick wall. And I think if we ourselves can't be, as cliche as it sounds, be the change that we want to see, then none of this is going to matter. Like, so within my own Mandir group and within our community here in the Toronto area, we have formed a network of teachers that are trying to address all of these things. So if we don't get up and start doing something, then it is always going to be first gen coming in, and with immigration always holding the baton, and that's what I actually see happening. It's something that Canada's probably had more immigration problems than the U.S., and it's something that we're dealing with here. And we see all the big displays during Diwali and Dussehra and all of that, and a lot of it certainly is first gen. But we have no one to blame but ourselves, because we ourselves are not getting involved. And that is a message to any second gen that is listening to this, is that it's one thing to sit in and bemoan what everyone is doing, but at least Vishal took the impetus to actually write something and to put it down on paper. And while I don't write essays, I do work within the community to try to be what is it that I never had growing up, because everything that you said is right. That's how most kids feel going to the temple, is that their parents bring them, they do arati and they do this and then they go home.
Yeah.
But but to try to bring that into their life is what's lacking, and I think that certainly needs to be addressed.
For sure. And yeah, I think you're doing great work, Shawn. And I think the only way that this is the trial by fire, and the only way we make progress is by people just trying to figure stuff out that works for them. And, that's certainly, for me, like this is always, it's obviously like a intellectual curiosity and a project, but it's ultimately a personal project for me, right? Like, so I'm also trying to define what it means for myself to be Hindu today. And that's at the root of everything, and so, I would say to second generation people listening who this resonates with, I'd encourage you to work through this, not just, work through it, obviously in your personal life for yourself, but, don't be shy to work through it publicly, because when you work through it publicly and you communicate your thought process and what works and what doesn't work, or and you communicate that to a broader on a platform, you'll find that you'll attract a lot of people who are going through something similar, and you'll learn from them. You'll find a community that way, and it'll be mutually enriching, I think. So yeah, I mean, there's just so much, whether it's like Substack or YouTube or whatever it is, like just if you're interested in this stuff, don't be shy just to like let your thoughts be known, because every time I share one of these thoughts, it's always the most satisfying aspect of it is, you get the messages from people who are like, man, like this is exactly what I've been thinking. I've never seen someone articulate it this way. And I think that is the fuel to keep going, because you slowly, start building an audience that way and finding people who think similarly. And that's how new communities form. Right. That's how new movements go. Like, you just have to brick by brick start attracting people who think similarly to you, and just keep thinking and speaking in public. And yeah, so I think we are. I know Mukunda was calling on it for us to take the mantle, but I think that's exactly what this is. Is by communicating these ideas in public. This is we're broadcasting a message that will attract like-minded people.
Right. And hey, sorry, I know, Vishal, you have some time. Do you have like 20 minutes? Maybe?
Yeah, I have like until 7:45. So I don't know.
Okay, cool. So can we go to some questions people have?
Sure.
And then we can loop back around. Okay. So, all right. So this is one. Hercules says, what concrete steps are you advocating, and how a Hindu American should go about religion and culture in the United States?
Yeah. So I think this goes back to the point I made earlier. So my real objective with that essay and a lot of what I write is to open up the thinking process. Like, I think a lot of people come to me and they're like, oh, well, what's the solution? Like, I have this like special temple design in my mind that's going to solve all the problems. But that's not how I think. I mean, for me, it's just like I'm looking for a more fruitful thought process that will yield more positive results. And I think for me, what I want to do, or what I'm encouraging people to do, is to change the paradigms through which they conceptualize Hindu identity or Hinduism. And I think by opening up those floodgates, the possibilities become a lot more abundant, and the forms in which Hindu identity can take in the diaspora. There's just a lot more creative potential, I think, once you strip yourself of the intellectual straitjacket, as I call it.
Here's another question, Karthik. Or not a question, it's a comment. Thanks, Vishal. Inability community come together is not a feature, it's a bug. It's a feature, not a bug. Stay on it. All right. So, I mean.
All right. Thanks, Karthik. I will. I appreciate it, man.
Okay. There's a bunch of stuff.
Give me an angry one. Give me a fob coming from my throat.
So, there's one, right? The Charvok fob. What's up, man? So, okay, there's a couple here that are pretty good. Let's see here. Get down here. Okay, so this is one where someone responding to this.
Vishal is wrong here, because the first and second gen are standing on the backs of what traditional Jews lay down their lives to protect those traditions that allow Vishal. Yeah, I mean, what do you want me to? Well, like, what does this guy want me to say? Like, this is. Yeah, I'm very grateful. Thank you. I'm so glad that people sacrifice their life. I mean it seriously. Like it is a remarkable thing, right? Like
Right.
this is one of the I always joke that I feel like I'm an Orientalist because I really only rediscovered Hindu heritage through the classics because I studied Latin and Greek in college, and I was like, I kind of found my way back to the Upanishads and
Right.
but I this is precisely why I feel like it's important to ask these questions. It's not I'm not asking these questions or stirring up these controversies because I'm hostile to Hindu thought or hostile to Hindu philosophy. I'm doing it because I want this dharmic thought. I want the spiritual heritage and philosophical heritage that we have to be vibrant and global in its scope. And to me, there's no better way to vindicate the sacrifices of our ancestors than to think boldly about what Dharma can look like in today's world and not be beholden by the old forms of tradition or ritual that we might have inherited. I think that is the sign of a healthy tradition, when it's able to adapt and able to achieve new forms and new levels of expansiveness as it reaches new frontiers. So thank you, this Jetsu 3 Yahoo. Thank you.
Yeah. Here's a question from Phil.
Yeah, so I would say that you have to try to I think it's very important to understand what people are fighting about, but you have to try and not take it seriously or don't let it get to you. You have to take it with some level of equanimity and understand, like, look, there are debates people having, but at the end of the day, what really matters is how you feel about it and what your thoughts about it. So I think that don't, and also like when you see people fighting, don't just because they have their own versions of what being a Hindu looks like you're not beholden to what their vision is. Yeah. So don't let don't let someone else's idea of how you should be stop you from exploring that identity on your own. Like you have that autonomy and you have that freedom, and you should exercise it.
So just one point with this question. I don't know if the person's still on. Is that so? He's saying that he finds it hard to stay connected with Hinduism. What does that mean for him? Like, how is it that you like? What are you trying to connect with?
Basically, he's saying that he's turned off by the bickering uncles.
Fighting, right?
He doesn't want to be a part of it.
Right, which is, I think that, I mean, growing up, I experienced that quite often.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, it happens all the time.
Like I remember growing up, and this is just a stupid story. In Southern California, they started the Federation of Indian Americans, and then within 3 years, it was Federation of Indian Americans of Indian Origin. There's two of them.
This is like the Life of Brian. What is the line in Life of Brian? The Jerusalem, the Jerusalem People's Front. And it's like, no, it's the People's Front of Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's right. But that's kind of what Hindus do. We do debate. We like difference. We like to engage, and sometimes it can cause, I guess, more problems than we need to. I mean, I guess we're all bickering uncles now, aren't we? I mean, look at the so here's a comment, which I actually think is a pretty interesting comment here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let me read it out. So if people, this sounds like a less of a first or second generation or India versus East Indies versus us problem, and more of a rise of secular modernity problem. First gen Hindus don't really have anyone sit down and explain things either. They just imitated their elders. He follows up with that.
Yep. Absolutely correct. And this is exactly the point I make in my first essay, The Hindu Case Against Hinduism, which is that Hindus have not properly confronted the encounter with secular modernity. I think that there was, at the onset of the colonial encounter, you did have a recognition, and maybe they didn't really one criticism you could make is that they were so overawed by the power of the British that they basically were just like, whatever you guys say is right. There's definitely some of that, but I think that they did intuitively grasp just how powerful and pervasive this new way of looking at the world was going to be. And I think that is why their ideas for transformation were so much more radical, because they saw that there was no going back. And so this is absolutely right. I mean, the rise of secular modernity is the central problem. And I think too often, and this is an issue in India, and it's an issue with the first generation. They think that they can inhabit a secular modern world when it comes to politics and economy, ignoring the fact that religion, culture is all downstream from politics and economy. So if you want to thrive in a modern capitalist democratic world that requires that you inhabit this secular modern worldview, this rationalist materialistic perspective, naturally that worldview is going to trickle down into the way that you look at matters of spirituality, matters of religion, matters of culture. You cannot just create like a artificial wall separating that one aspect of your life from everything else, like it's just, that's not the way it works. I mean, it's all pervasive, it's hegemonic, and it's going to impact how you look at everything. Max Weber famously said that we live in a disenchanted world. This was the what he said about capitalism. This idea that the forces of capital of modernity are they mechanize, and they mechanize all of existence, and they disenchant it. They take the magic out of the world. And that's true. We live in, we do live in a disenchanted world. And I don't think that we Hindu thinkers have properly thought about the implications for that, for Hindu culture, Hindu tradition, Hindu ritual.
Right. And, just on that point, I mean, Akshdeep actually has a good follow-up to this, which I think is well worth for us to consider. I think people are overestimating how much of the first generation's reality is due to general theological understanding, as opposed to them just performing rituals, because this is what they grew up with doing in India.
Akashdeep, you're preaching to the choir, my friend. This is what I've been saying.
And sometimes, like, I think that's where, they try to tell us an explanation of growing up, which they thought they had to make up maybe sometimes. Yeah. And then we're left, like, because we don't have, a lot of times didn't have to justify it.
We did not have
right. No.
Yeah, we do. We go and engage with Christians and Muslims and atheists out there, and they're like, "Why do you believe what you believe? What's this belief? Why do you have this?" And we're like,
Yeah, exactly.
That's why, like, I would still argue that it's up to us to be able to articulate those things. Because if I were to sit down with my mom and like ask her a whole bunch of things, she'd be like, she'll look at me as if I'm crazy, because that's not the environment that they grew up in. And I think we need more of the second gens trying to answer those questions. That's what we need.
Yes, and we have to be fearless about it. That's the thing. Like, I think that too often the second generation has allowed this fear of judgment from the first generation, or this fear of being, castigated as being deracinated or whatever. Like we've let that hold us back. I'm proud to be deracinated. Let me just say it. I'll say it for the public. It does not bother me. I am, that's the world I live in. And I'm going to think about these issues from my perspective. And that's just how it is.
Well, I think even the fact that you think about these issues, at least these particular issues, doesn't make you deracinated. But that's a whole other, like, it's like, like you can wear the garb and be racinated, I guess, or you can do the work inside, and be, so I think this is where a lot of it is. It's like, you don't have to appear to be Hindu, I mean, in any way, shape, or form, or you don't have to think like you just have to partake in some of this, like imbibe in some of it, right? And I think sometimes people just think you have to be all in or all out, and I think that's a weird mentality.
Yeah.
And here's actually a good question for you. What would help to hear is why a second gen you choose to stay Hindu. How would you make the case to yourself?
I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to how you think about the term Hindu and what is it to you. To me, because I reject this idea of Hinduism as a religion, Hindu to me is a civilizational affiliation. Like I consider myself, I have, I carry torches for two civilizations, for the modern American Western civilization and Hindu civilization. And I don't see these as in competition with each other. I see them as two guiding stars in my life. And I see, and I see my life's project as trying to find a synthesis between these two civilizational value systems for my own life and for what I think is a growing number of similarly situated second generation Hindu Americans who also are very grateful to be of the modern West, but also are very proud of this Hindu civilizational heritage that they have. So that to me is, it's a conviction that the Hindu civilizational heritage has something to offer, not just for my own life, but for the world at large. And that the wisdom that we find in our tradition, even though that wisdom can sometimes be hard to see behind all of the the uncle bickering, the ritual, whatever, it's there, and you have to go find it for yourself. But it's not hard to find, Just go pick up the Gita, pick up the Upanishads, pick up the Yoga Vashista, go pick up any of these texts, and just read them with an open mind, and you'll find that there's so much in there that is resonant with the struggles and demands of our modern American life. So that's why I choose to stay Hindu.
This this very question I had asked at a workshop that I did in Washington over the summer. I was asked to come do a workshop for one of those summer camps, and this was actually my first question that I asked them, is that why are you Hindu? And even the parents sitting in the audience couldn't really answer that question, because it's not something that anyone ever thinks about. Is that, well, why are you Hindus? Because if it's not a question you can answer, then what value is it bringing to your life? And the funny thing is that the parents that I spoke to afterwards, they basically said that, they never had to think about the question, because that was just the environment that they grew up in. And I said, when you come to North America now, you actually have two different choices that these kids are making. And I think it's a question that we have to ask yourself, is that why you choose to stay Hindu. And I think for myself is that it provides an opportunity to delve deeper into who you really are. One of those fundamental questions, like who are you really in this nature that you exist in? And you could explore it from a lot of different points of view, from a psychological point of view, from a philosophical point of view, from a metaphysical point of view. And I think, to me anyways, Hinduism provides the most robust answers to all of those questions. And I think for anyone growing up, whether it be second gen, third gen, or even younger kids, trying to understand that aspect of yourselves is why I choose to stay Hindu.
Good answer, man. Okay, so we have a couple more here. This is another, I guess, interesting question. Without lived practice and cultural continuity, what exactly anchors this cosmopolitan Hindu thought? Just a rootless philosophy can transform to anything by time?
I mean, frankly, the answer is I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know. I mean, I think that adaptation is something that happens organically. It happens based on the demands of the moment. And, I think the ultimate test is whether it takes. I don't think that there's any sort of normative description. I don't think there's a normative standard that you can set in advance of saying what is Hindu practice going to look like 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now? You really think it's going to be that similar to what it is today? The way the world works and the way things change. I mean, all you can do, I think, is is try to identify what it is in the tradition that is important and worth preserving, and trying to build a structure around it that serves the needs of the society that you live in and serves your needs as a member of that society. I think it's kind of a red herring to say that it's rootless philosophy that can transform into anything. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's like an anything goes. I think that, rules and regulations and these things are important, but I don't think that those are fixed in time at all. I do think that there's a lot more adaptation and flexibility built into, and I mean, you just look at, and I think this is something people just lose sight of, how much the tradition adapted in India itself. I mean, there's a kind of I feel like a misconception that, Hinduism was just frozen in time.
Yeah.
If you look at the intellectual history, or the cultural evolution of the various streams of Hindu tradition and Hindu thought, there were massive evolutionary shifts brought on by Islamic incursions, by the dominance of Buddhism, by Christianity. I mean, all of these external factors fundamentally changed the way people conceived of Hindu tradition in India. And so why would you expect that process not to continue outside of India in fundamentally different societal conditions?
Yeah, I mean, even the traditions that many people practice, the rituals, some of them are relatively new.
Yeah.
It's and they get adapted as technology improves and people have access to things, right?
It's crazy. People, you think now, you ask an average Hindu and they think temple worship, murti puja is an integral part of Hinduism. This was adopting temple worships and deity worship was a hugely controversial thing among Hindus when it started. You know, like when there was like huge fights between Brahminical orders about whether they should stick with the Vedic and aniconic worship, fire rituals versus doing the temple rituals. These were huge fights in India among Hindus when these practices started to change, and yet now we somehow look at everything as just like mandatory, integral parts of the tradition. It's not true. It really undersells how dynamic the tradition has been.
And the tradition's interesting too, because like a lot of the dynamism is hidden under the conservative commentarial tradition, right?
Hinduism.
Yeah. So like, you know, all these philosophies that rose and developed, even though they all say, oh, this is the original philosophy, it's all innovation. A lot of innovation happening through the traditions, right? And sometimes we just forget that because it has the veneer of conservative traditional like belief, right? And I think sometimes it's we have to learn to see past that and engage. Here's I think is an interesting response to you. I don't you can respond if you want to, but I think it's very interesting. So Hercules says Vishal is grounded in Protestantism tweet is belied by U.S. law, an inclusive scholarly view that American civil religion has a much wider religious frame. See Bella, Heidenberg, Eck. And then he follows this up with part 2, which is the U.S. is not a collection of communities, contradicts the country's civil traditions and history. Voluntary association is part of democracy and doesn't negate individual rights.
Yeah, so. Well, I'll address the second part first because this is true, and I probably should have clarified that in the tweet. What I meant when I said that America was not a collection of communities, I was distinguishing it from the Indian conception, which is where those communities are not voluntary, and that the idea is that your religious identity or your caste identity is kind of stamped onto you by the state, and you're kind of a fixed part of that community. And India doesn't really, the Indian state or Indian culture doesn't really look kindly upon the sort of fluidity of movement between those communities. In fact, they try very hard to kind of stop that through clamping down on conversion or whatever else. In America, obviously, we do have communities, but that voluntary nature of those associations is incredibly important. And that itself is grounded in the Protestant. So I think this is also a confusion that a lot of people, again, I probably should have done a better job of clarifying it. But when I say that America is grounded in Protestantism or radical Protestantism, that's not necessarily, that doesn't mean the actual religious tradition of Protestant Christianity. The idea is that Protestantism is an underlying system, that what those values were secularized, and that's what really catalyzed the formation of American society, of the American Republic. And so these ideas of, like the Calvinist work industriousness, this became Protestant work ethic in America. The sort of idea of the individual's the individual connection with the divine, not mediated by a clerical class. This is the roots of American freedom and liberty and individual pursuit of happiness. So it's not the Protestant Christianity per se, but it's the underlying system of Protestantism in a secularized form that forms the basis for American culture and society. And it's an important distinction to make.
Excellent. There's a couple more before we close out. I'm trying to find one that hey Suresh, you said there was a first gen question. Can you put that back up? I don't see it. And I guess Phil is going to ask you both. Well, here, I mean, I don't think that's again. I guess this might be a rehash, but if it is, we can move on.
Shawn, you take this one.
Yeah. My advice for young Hindus is to always question. I think questioning is the only way forward. I encourage it all the time, and I even tell like the younger kids that I work with, if I don't have an answer for you, let's see if we can find it out together. One of the things that I think happened for people of the second gen is that questions sometimes were just actively squashed, which is I think what most of us have that experience is that you wanted to know more and you didn't have the means. So my advice for young Hindus is to ask questions and just keep engaged.
That's good. I second that. That's great advice.
Okay. And let's end with this. If the last questions, guys, let me know. Vishal's got to go very soon. So here's the last question. I'd be curious to know if Vishal thinks it's even possible to practice tradition in a secular world.
I mean, I don't know what you really mean by tradition here. If you mean just like the continuation of a traditional ritual culture, I mean, you could be like the Amish, I guess, and kind of just detach yourself from modern secular society. And if that's really your goal, is to preserve like a very particular stream of ritual and tradition, I think that's probably the only way to do it. I think it's unrealistic to expect that you can assimilate into mainstream American politics and economic life and also maintain like a sustainable, transmittable tradition in the way that I think he's referring to it. I think that's that's futile. And if that's your goal, I think you're going to be disappointed, unfortunately, because it's not how people work. It's not how people operate.
Here's just a comment from Sri Sharma. This discussion has helped me understand why I have never felt disaffected as a second gen. I was raised outside temples and at gurukuls. Grateful for that. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, different people, I think, have different experiences, right? Like, I think people that grew up in a particular, like maybe like Chimanda or one of these particular communities, maybe don't have the same like disaffectedness that we do. Yeah. So, all right, cool. Well, thanks. Vishal, do you have any last comments?
No, I mean, this was a lot of fun. Yeah, I really, I think both of you guys, I admire you both a lot. I think you both do really great work. So I really enjoy speaking with you. And yeah, I just, it's been a lot of fun this weekend. What is it? Stirring the hornet's nest.
That's right.
So, I think this is good. Maybe I'll have to do it more often. It seems like it's a good way to, attract attention. But anyways, it's been a very fun. I encourage people to read the essay. I think that'll answer a lot of questions people have about my more considered views on this topic. And I'm just looking forward to writing and speaking about this more.
Shawn,
anything? I want to thank both of you for having the conversation that I think we have been meaning to have and was necessary to have. And I think more so growing up in North America, that we now have to start thinking about these things a little bit more seriously. And I also think that it is of value to Hindus from India to study diasporas that have gone through it, just to simply learn like what was their experiences, what was their challenges, what could they have done better. And now that we're here in North America, whether it be in US and Canada, it's up to us to continue that tradition of inquiry. And I think that is what I welcome the most, whether it's controversial or not, whether I agree with what's being said. If we don't talk about it, then we're going to be stuck in a tradition that was never meant to be static. And I think that's what I value the most. So thank you for hosting this and for at least engaging in the conversation that was very much needed.
No, I appreciate it, God. This is awesome. I was trying to get Indu Vishwanathan on, but she wasn't able to. Maybe at another point, I feel like sometimes these spaces are also dominated a lot by men. And I would love to have their thoughts and views to women and other people just to see, like, are we seeing the world differently? And if we are, how do we engage with that, and how do we turn with that? And on your point, Shawn, I think staticness is not what we're about. The Samudra Manthan, right? This entire churning of the ocean is kind of our emblem as Hindu society, as the temple of Suvarnabhumi, or the airport of Suvarnabhumi. When you land, you see that big old, the devas and asuras wrestling the mountain. So thank you both. This was fantastic, awesome. I really appreciate it, and let's do it again sometime.
Anytime.
Goodbye. By the way, everyone follow Vishal. Check out Hindu Lifestyle with Shawn.
And
everyone.
Sorry to Shawn about his Blue Jays last night. Sad day for all Canadians. Sad day for all Canadians.
Tell me about it.
Brutal.
All right, everyone.
All right, take care, man. Bye.
पावन मुनि जन यमुना तीरे पावन मुनि जन यमुना तीरे गायती वनमाली गायती वनमाली मधुरम गायती वनमाली